The silence in the briefing room was deafening. 37 hardened Navy personnel, men and women who had seen combat in 3 different theaters, sat frozen as Commander Sarah Mitchell rolled up her sleeves. What they saw next would shatter everything they thought they knew about their respected leader. The scars weren't random. They weren't from shrapnel or enemy fire. They formed a pattern that told a story no one expected, a story that would expose the military's darkest secret and change how the entire base viewed courage, survival, and what it truly means to serve your country. This is that story, a story that began not on any battlefield, but in a place where the enemy wore familiar faces and the war was fought in shadows. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Station Norfolk as Commander Sarah Mitchell walked through the base gates for what she thought would be just another routine day. At 34, she commanded the respect of every sailor under her watch. Her record was spotless, her leadership unquestioned, and her dedication to the service absolute. What no one knew was that this Tuesday in March would become the day everything changed. Sarah had spent the previous evening preparing for the quarterly readiness briefing. As the head of Naval Intelligence Operations for the Atlantic Fleet's Special Operations Division, these meetings were crucial. She reviewed personnel files, mission reports, and training schedules until well past midnight. The coffee maker in her quarters worked overtime, just like she did most nights. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as 37 officers and senior enlisted personnel filtered in. These weren't ordinary sailors. They were the cream of the crop, handpicked for their skills, their loyalty, and their ability to handle classified operations that most people would never know existed. Among them was Lieutenant Commander James Walsh, a SEAL team leader with 4 deployments under his belt. Master Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos had served for 22 years and had seen more action than most generals. Captain Robert Hayes, the base executive officer, sat at the head of the table, his weathered face showing the stress of managing operations across multiple continents. Sarah entered the room, carrying her usual stack of folders and her ever-present tablet. She wore her dress blues, as protocol demanded for formal briefings. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, not a strand out of place. The room gradually quieted as she approached the podium. This was routine, she thought. Standard briefing, standard procedures, standard day. The presentation began normally enough. Sarah clicked through slides showing deployment schedules, readiness reports, and intelligence assessments. She discussed the ongoing situation in the South China Sea, updates from the Middle East, and coordination efforts with allied forces. The officers took notes, asked pointed questions, and engaged in the kind of strategic discussion that happened in rooms like this around the world every day. It was during a question about personnel psychological evaluations that everything changed. Lieutenant Commander Walsh raised his hand and asked about stress indicators among special operations personnel. It was a valid concern. The suicide rate among military personnel had been climbing, and special operations forces faced unique pressures. Sarah had dealt with this issue before, both professionally and personally, though no one in the room knew about the personal part. As she answered Walsh's question, Sarah found herself talking about the importance of recognizing signs of trauma, the need for open communication, and the dangerous culture of silence that often surrounded mental health issues in the military. Her voice carried a passion that surprised even her. She spoke about how trauma could manifest in unexpected ways, how survival sometimes required methods that others might not understand, and how the scars of service weren't always visible. The room was paying close attention now. This wasn't typical briefing material, but it was clearly important to their commander. Master Chief Santos leaned forward in her chair. Captain Hayes set down his pen and focused entirely on Sarah's words. There was something in her tone, something personal, that made everyone listen more carefully. Sarah realized she was moving beyond the prepared talking points. She was speaking from experience, from a place of knowledge that came from somewhere other than training manuals and case studies. The words kept flowing, and she found herself talking about how sometimes the people who seemed strongest were actually fighting the hardest battles, how appearance could be deceiving, how survival took many forms. Then, Lieutenant Commander Walsh asked a question that changed everything. Commander, do you speak from personal experience? Have you dealt with trauma among your personnel that gives you this insight? The room went completely silent. Sarah stood at the podium, her hands gripping the sides, and realized she was at a crossroads. She could give a standard answer, deflect the question, and return to the scheduled briefing, where she could tell the truth. A truth she had kept hidden for more than a decade. A truth that explained why she understood trauma so well, why she could spot the signs others missed, and why she fought so hard to create an environment where her people felt safe. She looked around the room at faces she trusted, at people who had followed her through dangerous missions and challenging deployments. These were her people, her team, her responsibility. They deserved honesty from their leader, even if that honesty came with risk. Sarah stepped away from the podium and moved to the center of the room. Without saying a word, she began rolling up the sleeves of her dress blue uniform. First the left sleeve, then the right. As the fabric moved up her arms, a pattern of scars became visible. Not random scars from accidents or combat, but deliberate marks arranged in careful lines and patterns. The silence in the room deepened. Every person present was a professional, trained to observe and analyze. They could see that these weren't battle scars. They weren't from shrapnel or knife wounds or any kind of enemy action. These were something else entirely, something that told a very different story about their commander's past. Master Chief Santos was the first to understand. Her expression changed from curiosity to recognition to something like protective anger. She had seen marks like these before, in different contexts, on different people. She knew what they meant, and she knew how much courage it took to reveal them. Captain Hayes felt his stomach drop as the realization hit him. He had worked with Commander Mitchell for 3 years. He had watched her excel in every assignment, lead with distinction, and earn the loyalty of everyone under her command. He had never suspected that she carried this kind of hidden history. Lieutenant Commander Walsh felt a wave of respect, mixed with guilt. His question had pushed their commander into this revelation, and he wasn't sure if that was good or terrible. But looking at the scars, understanding what they represented, he began to comprehend why Sarah Mitchell was such an exceptional leader, why she could read people so well, why she never gave up on anyone. Sarah stood in the center of the room with her sleeves rolled up and her scars visible. For the first time in her military career, she was completely vulnerable in front of her subordinates. The professional mask was gone, replaced by raw honesty that none of them had expected to see. "These aren't just marks of war," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "But they are marks of survival." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would change how they understood leadership, courage, and the complex ways that people overcome the worst experiences life can offer. But this was just the beginning of a story that would shake the entire base and force everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about strength, service, and the hidden battles that some people fight every single day. The silence stretched on as 37 military professionals tried to process what their commander had just shown them. Outside, the normal sounds of the base continued. Ships moved in the harbor, aircraft took off and landed, and thousands of personnel went about their daily duties, unaware that in one small briefing room, everything was about to change. Sarah looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her people one by one. She saw surprise, respect, concern, and something she hadn't expected, a deepening of the trust they already had in her. These were warriors who understood that some battles were fought in places where medals weren't awarded and victories weren't celebrated. They were beginning to understand that their commander had fought and won battles they never knew existed. What happened next would test everyone in that room and ultimately transform how an entire military installation understood the nature of service, sacrifice, and the complex paths that lead people to become the leaders others choose to follow. The weight of silence pressed down on the briefing room like deep ocean water. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood with her sleeves still rolled up, her scars visible to 37 pairs of eyes that had suddenly been given access to a story they never expected to hear. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a choice that would either destroy her career or transform how everyone in the room understood what it meant to serve. Master Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos was the first to move. She stood slowly from her chair, her 22 years of service evident in the deliberate way she carried herself. Santos had seen enough of the world to recognize what those scars meant, and enough of human nature to understand the courage it took to reveal them. She walked to the front of the room and positioned herself next to her commander, not quite at attention, but clearly showing solidarity. "Ma'am," Santos said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect the hard way. "Whatever you need to tell us, we're here to listen." The simple statement broke something open in the room. Captain Hayes nodded slowly, his earlier shock giving way to the kind of focused attention he reserved for the most critical briefings. Lieutenant Commander Walsh leaned forward, his earlier question now seeming like the catalyst for something much larger than he had anticipated. Around the room, other officers and senior enlisted personnel shifted in their seats, not with discomfort, but with the recognition that they were about to hear something that mattered. Sarah looked at Santos, then around the room at faces she had worked with, trusted, and led through countless challenges. These people had followed her orders in dangerous situations, trusted her judgment when lives were at stake, and believed in her leadership when everything else was uncertain. She owed them honesty, even if that honesty came with personal cost. "I need to tell you a story," Sarah said, her voice stronger now that she had committed to this path. "A story that starts long before I ever wore this uniform, but explains everything about why I wear it now." She moved to the front of the room, away from the podium with its formal structure and official presentations. This wasn't going to be a briefing in any traditional sense. This was going to be the kind of conversation that happened between people who trusted each other completely, the kind that could only happen when someone chose to be completely honest about the most difficult parts of their life. 15 years ago, I wasn't Commander Mitchell," Sarah began. "I was Sarah Chun, a 19-year-old college freshman at UC Berkeley, studying international relations and planning to work for the State Department. I came from what everyone would call a good family. My father was a successful engineer, my mother taught high school literature, and I had every advantage a young person could want." The room remained completely quiet. This wasn't what anyone had expected to hear. They knew their commander had joined the Navy relatively late compared to academy graduates, but they had assumed she was simply someone who had discovered her calling later than others. The reality was proving to be far more complex. "I was engaged to be married," Sarah continued. "David Morrison was a senior at Berkeley, pre-law, from a family that moved in the same social circles as mine. Everyone thought we were perfect together. My parents loved him, his parents loved me, and we had our whole future planned out. Wedding after graduation, law school for him, master's degree for me, careers in San Francisco, house in the suburbs, 2 kids, and a golden retriever." Master Chief Santos watched her commander's face as she spoke, noting the careful control in her expression. Santos had interrogated enough people to recognize when someone was working hard to maintain composure while discussing something that still carried emotional weight. Whatever story was coming, it had shaped the woman standing in front of them in fundamental ways. David was charming, intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that he knew what was best for everyone around him, Sarah said. "Especially me. It started small, the way these things always do. Suggestions about what I should wear, what classes I should take, which friends I should spend time with. He said he was helping me become the kind of woman who could support a successful man's career." Lieutenant Commander Walsh felt his jaw tighten. As a SEAL, he had worked with law enforcement on domestic violence cases during some of his stateside assignments. He was beginning to understand where this story was heading, and why their commander's insights into trauma and survival were so precise. "By the time I realized what was happening, I was completely isolated," Sarah continued. "David had systematically removed every support system I had. My friends were bad influences who were jealous of our relationship. My family was old-fashioned and didn't understand modern relationships. My professors were trying to fill my head with feminist nonsense that would ruin our future together." She paused, looking down at her arms where the scars were still visible in the fluorescent light of the briefing room. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, Not the professional tone of a military officer, but the raw honesty of someone who had survived something terrible. When isolation wasn't enough to control me, David moved to other methods. He was studying law, so he knew exactly how to hurt someone without leaving evidence that would hold up in court. He knew pressure points, he knew how to cause pain without causing obvious injury, and he knew how to make someone believe that they deserved whatever happened to them. Captain Hayes felt his hands clench into fists under the table. As a career military officer, he had encountered domestic violence situations before, but hearing about it from someone he respected and worked with daily gave it an immediacy that made him angry in a way that was difficult to control. "The scars you see," Sarah said, rolling her sleeves up slightly higher to make the marks more visible, "aren't from David directly. They're from me. When the pain of staying became greater than the fear of the consequences of fighting back, I did the only thing I could think of to survive. I started cutting myself." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Every person present had dealt with self-harm among military personnel. It was a reality of their profession that people sometimes reached breaking points where they hurt themselves rather than deal with whatever they were facing. But hearing it from their commander, understanding it as a survival strategy rather than a breakdown, changed how they thought about it entirely. "I know how that sounds," Sarah said quickly, seeing the expressions around the room. "I know how it looks. But in that situation, with David watching every move I made, controlling every aspect of my life, the only thing I could control was my own pain. When he hurt me, I had no choice in the matter. When I hurt myself, it was my decision. It was the only way I could maintain any sense of autonomy." Master Chief Santos nodded slowly. It was a horrible kind of logic, but it made sense. In situations where every other form of control had been stripped away, sometimes the only choice left was how to experience pain. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't recommended, but it was understandable as a desperate attempt to maintain some form of agency. "The cutting gave me something else too," Sarah continued. "It gave me visible injuries that I could explain away, but that also told a story to anyone who was trained to look for signs of abuse. When I finally got to the campus health center, the nurse who treated my cuts knew immediately that something was wrong. She asked the right questions, she knew the signs, and she connected me with people who could help." Lieutenant Commander Walsh leaned back in his chair, beginning to understand not just what their commander had survived, but how that survival had shaped her into the leader she became. The way she could read people, the way she created environments where personnel felt safe to report problems, the way she never gave up on anyone who was struggling. It all made sense now. "Getting away from David wasn't easy," Sarah said. "He was smart, connected, and absolutely convinced that I belonged to him. When I tried to leave the first time, he found me within 6 hours. When I tried to get help from the police, he had already prepared explanations for everything they might find. When I tried to tell my parents what was happening, he had spent months convincing them that I was becoming unstable and unreliable." The room was completely absorbed in the story now. These were people who understood tactical situations, who knew how enemies operated, and who could recognize the strategic elements of what their commander was describing. David Morrison had been conducting a campaign of psychological warfare against a 19-year-old college student, using methods that were both sophisticated and brutal. "What finally saved me was a combination of luck, planning, and the kind of support that I try to provide for all of you now," Sarah said. "The campus counselor connected me with a women's shelter that specialized in helping people escape abusive relationships. They taught me how to plan, how to gather resources secretly, how to disappear in a way that wouldn't leave traces he could follow." Captain Hayes was taking mental notes now. This wasn't just a personal story. It was a lesson in operational security, in psychological warfare, and in the kind of strategic thinking that had made Commander Mitchell such an effective intelligence officer. "The day I left, I'd been planning for 3 months," Sarah continued. "I had established a new identity, secured financial resources that David couldn't access, and identified a location where I could start over completely. I left everything behind, my name, my family, my entire life, and became someone else entirely." The magnitude of that decision hit everyone in the room. To completely abandon your identity your family, your entire life at 19 years old required a level of courage and determination that none of them had fully appreciated in their commander before this moment. Sarah Chun died that day, she said quietly, and Sarah Mitchell was born. I chose the name carefully, Sarah, because it was close enough to my original name that I would respond to it naturally. Mitchell, because it was my maternal grandmother's maiden name, something that wouldn't show up in any records David had access to. The room processed this information in complete silence. Their commander had literally created herself from nothing, built an entire new life from scratch, and somehow transformed the trauma of that experience into the strength that made her such an effective leader. What happened next, Sarah said, looking around the room one more time, is the story of how someone with no past, no family, and no support system decided to build a life dedicated to making sure other people never had to face their battles alone. The weight of that statement settled over the briefing room like evening fog. Everyone present was beginning to understand that the story they were hearing wasn't just about their commander's past. It was about the foundation of everything she had built since then, including the command structure and support systems that protected and guided all of them. The transformation from Sarah Chun to Sarah Mitchell hadn't happened overnight. And as Commander Mitchell continued her story, the 37 people in the briefing room began to understand just how deliberate and strategic that transformation had been. This wasn't just someone who had escaped a bad situation. This was someone who had engineered an entirely new existence with the kind of tactical precision they recognized from their most complex operations. After I left California, I spent 6 months in Portland, working as a waitress and taking night classes to finish my degree under my new identity, Sarah said. The women's shelter had connected me with a network of people who helped domestic violence survivors establish new lives. They taught me how to build a credit history, how to create employment records, how to become someone who existed in all the databases that modern life requires. Master Chief Santos found herself impressed despite the tragic circumstances. Creating a new identity wasn't as simple as changing your name. It required understanding bureaucratic systems, knowing which documents led to other documents, and having the patience to build credibility slowly over time. It was the kind of operation that required both intelligence and persistence. But I realized that just surviving wasn't enough, Sarah continued. David Morrison was still out there, and there were other women going through what I had experienced. The systems that were supposed to protect people like me had failed completely. Law enforcement couldn't help when the abuse was psychological and carefully hidden. Family and friends couldn't help when it had been systematically turned against the victim. Traditional support systems couldn't help when the abuser was smart enough to work around them. Lieutenant Commander Walsh recognized the strategic thinking in what their commander was describing. She hadn't just escaped. She had analyzed the weaknesses in the systems that were supposed to provide protection and safety. That kind of analytical approach to problems was exactly what made her such an effective intelligence officer. That's when I decided to join the military, Sarah said. Not because I wanted to run away from what had happened to me, but because I wanted to build the skills and authority to make sure it never happened to anyone else on my watch. Captain Hayes leaned forward in his chair. This was the part of the story that connected directly to the woman he had worked with for 3 years. He was beginning to understand that every decision Commander Mitchell had made in her military career had been influenced by her determination to create the kind of environment where people were protected and supported. I enlisted in the Navy as Sarah Mitchell, a college graduate with no military family background who wanted to serve her country, she continued. I chose the Navy because it offered the best opportunities for intelligence work, and I knew that information and analysis were going to be my weapons of choice in a larger war I was planning to fight. The phrase, larger war, caught everyone's attention. They were beginning to realize that their commander didn't just see her military service as a career. She saw it as part of a campaign that had started with her own survival and had evolved into something much more comprehensive. Boot camp was interesting, Sarah said. And for the first time since she had started telling her story, there was a hint of dry humor in her voice. I was probably the only recruit who had already mastered the art of following orders from someone who might hurt you if you didn't comply perfectly. I was definitely the only one who had already learned how to disappear your personality so completely that you could survive any kind of psychological pressure. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably at that observation. They had all been through military training, and they understood how it was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to military standards. Hearing it described as something their commander had already experienced in a far more brutal context gave them a new perspective on both experiences. What I learned during my first enlistment was that the military had the same problems that had failed me in civilian life, just in different forms, Sarah said. Sexual harassment and assault were endemic. Chain of command structures could be used to silence victims just as effectively as psychological manipulation. And the warrior culture that made our forces so effective in combat could also be used to shame anyone who admitted to vulnerability or asked for help. The room was completely focused now. This wasn't just personal history. This was a critique of military culture from someone who understood it from the inside, who had experienced its failures personally, and who had spent years working to address those failures from within the system. So I made a decision, Sarah continued. I was going to work my way up the chain of command until I had enough authority to change things, not through official channels or policy recommendations, but by creating environments where the failures I had experienced couldn't happen to the people under my command. Master Chief Santos nodded slowly. She had noticed over the years that Commander Mitchell's units had unusually low rates of personnel problems, high levels of trust between ranks, and a culture where people felt safe reporting issues. She had attributed it to good leadership, but now she understood it was something more deliberate and systematic. Every assignment, every promotion, every career decision was made with that goal in mind, Sarah said. I specialized in intelligence work because information is power, and I wanted the kind of power that could protect people. I focused on special operations support because those personnel face the highest stress levels and need the most sophisticated support systems. I pushed for command positions because that's where you can implement the changes that matter. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was beginning to understand why Commander Mitchell's pre-deployment briefings were so thorough, why she knew every person in her command personally, and why she had such effective systems for identifying personnel who were struggling before problems became crises. It wasn't just good leadership. It was the result of someone who had experienced the worst possible failure of support systems and was determined to prevent that from happening to anyone else. The scars you see, Sarah said, looking down at her arms again, represent the worst period of my life. But they also represent the moment when I learned that survival sometimes requires methods that other people don't understand or approve of. They remind me every day that the people under my command might be fighting battles that aren't visible, and that my job is to create an environment where they don't have to fight those battles alone. Captain Hayes felt a wave of respect for his subordinate that was unlike anything he had experienced in his military career. He had always known that Commander Mitchell was exceptional, but he was beginning to understand that her effectiveness came from a depth of experience and commitment that went far beyond normal professional dedication. There's more to this story, Sarah said, looking around the room, because David Morrison didn't just disappear when I did. He spent years looking for me, and when he finally found me, it led to a confrontation that tested everything I had learned about survival, strategy, and using the system to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The room went even quieter at that statement. They had thought the story was about overcoming past trauma, but apparently there was a more recent chapter that brought those past experiences into direct conflict with Commander Mitchell's current life. 3 years ago, just after I took this command position, David tracked me down, Sarah continued. By then, he was a successful attorney in Los Angeles, married to a woman who reminded him of how I had been when we first met. He was older, smarter, and had access to resources that made him far more dangerous than he had been 15 years earlier. Master Chief Santos felt her jaw clench. The idea that someone had threatened her commander on her watch made her angry in a way that was difficult to control. But she also recognized that they were about to hear about how someone with Commander Mitchell's experience and training had handled that threat. When David found me, he thought he was dealing with the same 19-year-old girl who had run away from him 15 years earlier, Sarah said. He had no idea that Sarah Chun had become Commander Sarah Mitchell, that the scared college student had become a naval intelligence officer with 15 years of training in information warfare, strategic planning, and resource management. The room was completely absorbed now. This wasn't just a story about surviving trauma. It was about what happened when someone who had been victimized became someone with the skills and authority to turn the tables completely. What David Morrison discovered, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that was slightly frightening, was that you should never threaten someone who has spent their entire adult life learning how to identify, analyze, and neutralize threats, especially when that person has access to resources that can make your life very complicated in ways you never saw coming. The silence in the room now had a different quality. Everyone present was trained in strategic operations, psychological warfare, and resource management. They were beginning to understand that the conclusion of this story was going to involve their commander using her professional skills to handle a personal threat. And they were all very interested in hearing exactly how that had played out. The confrontation with David changed everything, Sarah said. Not just for me, but for how I understood my role here, my responsibilities to all of you, and what it means to use the authority and resources we have been given to protect the people who depend on us. She looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of people who had followed her through dangerous missions and trusted her judgment in life-or-death situations. They were about to learn exactly how their commander had handled the most personal threat she had ever faced, and how that experience had shaped the woman who now led them through challenges they couldn't even imagine. The tension in the briefing room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife as Commander Mitchell prepared to describe her confrontation with David Morrison. The 37 military personnel present understood strategy, tactics, and the careful application of force to achieve objectives. They were about to learn how their commander had applied those principles to the most personal threat imaginable. David's first contact came through official channels, Sarah said, her voice taking on the crisp tone she used when briefing operational details. He had hired a private investigator who discovered my military service record. Then, he contacted the base through his law firm, claiming to represent a client who needed to serve legal papers related to an identity theft case involving someone named Sarah Chin. Captain Hayes felt his stomach tighten. As the executive officer, any legal inquiries that came to the base crossed his desk. He didn't remember this specific case, which meant Commander Mitchell had handled it through other channels. That suggested a level of operational security that went far beyond normal legal matters. The beautiful thing about having spent 15 years in naval intelligence, Sarah continued, is that you develop contacts throughout the system. Within 6 hours of David's inquiry, I knew exactly who he was, where he lived, what law firm he worked for, who he was married to, what his financial situation looked like, and what kind of legal troubles he could potentially face if someone with the right resources decided to examine his life closely. Master Chief Santos found herself nodding with professional appreciation. This was exactly the kind of intelligence gathering that made their operation successful. Identify the threat, analyze its capabilities and vulnerabilities, and develop a comprehensive understanding before taking any action. I also learned some very interesting information about David's current wife, Jennifer, Sarah said, her expression hardening. Medical records showed patterns of injuries consistent with domestic violence. Credit reports showed that David had assumed control over all of her financial accounts. Employment records showed that she had left 3 different jobs in the past 2 years, always shortly after starting to show signs of independence. Lieutenant Commander Walsh leaned forward in his chair. As someone who had worked domestic violence cases, he recognized the pattern Commander Mitchell was describing. David Morrison hadn't changed. He had simply found a new victim and was repeating the same cycle of abuse that had driven Sarah away 15 years earlier. So I had a choice, Sarah continued. I could handle this as a personal matter, using my position and resources to make David disappear from my life without regard for collateral damage. Or I could handle it as a military operation, with specific objectives that included neutralizing the threat to me while also protecting other potential victims. The room was completely silent now. Everyone present understood the difference between those two approaches. Personal revenge versus professional responsibility. Both were understandable, but Only one was consistent with the values they had sworn to uphold. I chose the military operation, Sarah said. Objective 1. Neutralize David's threat to me permanently. Objective 2. Protect his current wife and any future victims. Objective 3. Ensure that David faced appropriate consequences for his actions without compromising my position or identity. Captain Hayes recognized the structure of operational planning in what Commander Mitchell was describing. Clear objectives, multiple phases, consideration of secondary effects, and built-in safeguards to protect friendly assets. This wasn't revenge. This was a carefully planned campaign. Phase 1 was intelligence gathering, Sarah said. I used my security clearance and intelligence contacts to build a complete profile of David's activities over the past 15 years. What I found was a pattern of behavior that would have impressed any counterintelligence analyst. David had refined his methods significantly since our relationship. She moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room and began sketching a timeline, the way she would during any operational briefing. The familiar format helped everyone in the room follow the strategic elements of what she was describing. David had learned to select victims more carefully, Sarah continued, adding notes to her timeline. Professional women with limited family support, high achievers who were socially isolated, people who had something to lose if their personal lives became public. He had also learned to use legal intimidation and financial control more effectively than physical violence. Master Chief Santos studied the timeline with professional interest. This wasn't just about Commander Mitchell's personal history. This was an analysis of how predators evolved and adapted their methods. It was exactly the kind of threat assessment they might conduct on any adversary. Jennifer Morrison, David's current wife, fit his preferred victim profile perfectly, Sarah said. Successful marketing executive, no close family, recently relocated to Los Angeles for her career. David had isolated her using the same methods he had used on me, but with 15 years of additional experience and refinement. The room processed this information with the kind of focused attention they gave to any operational briefing. They were beginning to understand that Commander Mitchell hadn't just been protecting herself. She had been conducting a rescue operation for someone else who was trapped in the same situation she had escaped. Phase 2 was establishing contact with Jennifer, Sarah continued. This required careful planning because David was monitoring all of her communications and controlling her access to outside support. I couldn't approach her directly without putting her at risk. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was impressed despite himself. Extracting someone from an abusive relationship was essentially a hostage rescue operation, requiring the same careful planning and execution as any high-stakes military operation. I used a combination of professional networking and staged coincidences to create opportunities to interact with Jennifer in settings where David couldn't monitor or control the contact, Sarah said. Marketing conferences, professional development seminars, social events where she had legitimate reasons to be present and engage with other people. She added more details to her timeline, showing how the operation had unfolded over several months. The patience and strategic thinking involved was exactly what they would expect from someone with Commander Mitchell's intelligence background. The breakthrough came when Jennifer mentioned in casual conversation that she was interested in self-defense classes, Sarah said. That gave me an opportunity to recommend a specific program that was run by retired military personnel who understood how to help people in dangerous situations. Captain Hayes recognized the elegance of that approach. Rather than directly confronting the abuse situation, Commander Mitchell had created a pathway for Jennifer to access resources and training that would enable her to protect herself. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything about David's current activities, Sarah continued. Financial records, communication patterns, legal cases he was working on, professional associations, social connections. The goal was to build a complete picture of his life so that when I acted against him, I could predict and counter any response he might make. The room was following the operational details with complete fascination. This was exactly the kind of thorough preparation that made complex operations successful. No detail was too small, no potential consequence was ignored. Phase 3 was the direct confrontation, Sarah said, her voice taking on a harder edge. By this point, I had been in contact with Jennifer for 6 months. She had started the self-defense training, established some independent financial resources, and begun to understand that her situation wasn't normal or acceptable. Master Chief Santos found herself holding her breath. This was the moment when all the planning and preparation would either succeed or fail catastrophically. David's approach to me was exactly what I had expected, Sarah continued. Psychological intimidation, legal threats, attempts to use official channels to cause problems for my military career. He assumed that the same tactics that had worked 15 years earlier would work again. She turned back to face the room, her expression showing a combination of professional satisfaction and personal vindication that everyone present recognized from successful operations. What David didn't understand, Sarah said, was that Commander Sarah Mitchell had resources, training, and support systems that 19-year-old Sarah Chun never had. And, more importantly, I had learned that sometimes the best defense is an overwhelming offense. The room waited in complete silence for her to continue. They all understood that they were about to hear how their commander had used her professional skills to handle a personal threat, and they were all very interested in the tactical details of how that had played out. The operation I conducted against David Morrison, Sarah said, neutralized him as a threat permanently while protecting both Jennifer and myself. But it also taught me something important about the responsibilities that come with the authority and resources we have been given. She looked around the room at faces that were completely focused on her words. These were people who understood power, who wielded it responsibly, and who needed to understand how their commander thought about the ethical implications of using their capabilities outside of normal military operations. What I learned, Sarah said, was that when you have the skills and resources to protect people who can't protect themselves, you have a moral obligation to use those capabilities, even when it's not part of your official duties, and even when it puts you at personal risk. The implications of that statement settled over the briefing room like a weight. Everyone present was beginning to understand that the story they were hearing wasn't just about their commander's personal history. It was about the philosophy that guided how she approached her responsibilities to all of them. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of the briefing room, looking at 37 faces that had been fundamentally changed by the story they had just heard. The silence was different now. Not the shocked quiet of people trying to process unexpected information, but the focused attention of professionals who understood they were about to receive the most important part of an operational briefing. The final phase of my operation against David Morrison, Sarah said, required coordination with civilian law enforcement, careful timing, and the kind of precise execution that leaves no room for mistakes. Because when you're dealing with someone who has spent years perfecting methods of control and intimidation, you only get one chance to stop them permanently. She turned back to the timeline on the whiteboard and added the final series of events that had brought her personal war to its conclusion. The key was Jennifer, Sarah continued. By the time we were ready to act, she had documented months of abuse using methods I had taught her. Hidden cameras, financial records, medical documentation, communication logs. She had also established an independent support network and secure financial resources that David couldn't access or control. Master Chief Santos nodded with professional respect. Creating a documentary record while living with an abuser required the kind of operational security and personal courage that was extraordinary by any standard. On the day we moved, Jennifer filed for divorce and a restraining order simultaneously, Sarah said. But more importantly, she also filed criminal complaints for domestic violence, financial abuse, and stalking. The evidence package she provided to law enforcement was so comprehensive that they had no choice but to take immediate action. Captain Hayes was impressed by the coordination involved. Timing multiple legal actions to occur simultaneously prevented David from using his legal knowledge to counter or deflect any single complaint. While Jennifer was dealing with the civilian legal system, I activated a parallel investigation through military intelligence channels, Sarah continued. David's attempts to track me down had involved several activities that violated federal laws related to accessing classified information and interfering with military operations. Lieutenant Commander Walsh leaned forward with interest. This was where Commander Mitchell's professional authority and personal situation intersected in ways that gave her options that civilian victims wouldn't have. Within 48 hours, David Morrison was facing criminal charges in two different jurisdictions: a federal investigation for attempting to compromise military personnel and a State Bar Association inquiry into professional misconduct, Sarah said. His law firm was reviewing his cases for potential malpractice issues. His financial accounts were frozen pending investigation, and his professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The room processed this information with professional admiration. This wasn't just neutralizing a threat. This was completely dismantling an adversary's capability to cause harm to anyone. But the most important outcome, Sarah said, wasn't what happened to David. It was what happened to Jennifer. She successfully divorced him, maintained control of her assets, and used her experience to start a nonprofit organization that helps other professional women escape abusive relationships. Master Chief Santos felt a wave of satisfaction at that outcome. Turning a rescue operation into a force multiplication that could protect other potential victims was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made complex operations truly successful. The operation taught me something important about leadership and responsibility, Sarah continued, moving away from the whiteboard to face her people directly. When you have the training, resources, and authority to protect people who can't protect themselves, using those capabilities isn't just an option, it's an obligation. She looked around the room at faces that were completely focused on her words. These were people who wielded significant power in various forms, who had access to resources and information that most people didn't, and who needed to understand how their commander thought about the ethical implications of that power. Every person in this room has capabilities that most people don't, Sarah said. Intelligence training, operational resources, security clearances, access to information systems, and the authority that comes with military rank. That gives all of us the ability to help people who are facing problems they can't solve alone. Captain Hayes was beginning to understand where this was leading. The story about Commander Mitchell's past wasn't just personal revelation. It was the foundation for how she expected her people to approach their responsibilities both on and off duty. I'm not suggesting that anyone here should conduct unauthorized operations or exceed their authority, Sarah said quickly. But I am telling you that when you see someone who needs help and you have the legal and appropriate resources to provide that help, you have a moral obligation to act. She moved to the center of the room, the same position where she had first revealed her scars, and started this entire conversation. The reason I'm telling you this story now is because 3 days ago, I received a report that one of our personnel is in a situation that requires exactly this kind of intervention, Sarah said. Petty Officer Second Class Amanda Torres has been dealing with a stalking situation that civilian law enforcement has been unable to address effectively. The room's attention sharpened immediately. This wasn't just about their commander's past. This was about a current situation involving one of their own people. Torres's ex-husband has been violating restraining orders, making threats, and using his knowledge of her military service to intimidate her in ways that civilian authorities don't understand, Sarah continued. The situation has escalated to the point where Torres is afraid to leave base, and it's affecting her ability to perform her duties. Lieutenant Commander Walsh felt his jaw tighten. Military personnel faced unique vulnerabilities when dealing with civilian problems, especially when those problems involve people who understood how to exploit military culture and procedures. This is where all of you come in, Sarah said. We're going to conduct an operation to neutralize this threat permanently, protect Petty Officer Torres, and ensure that her ex-husband faces appropriate consequences for his actions. And we're going to do it using the same principles I used with David Morrison. Comprehensive intelligence gathering, careful coordination with appropriate authorities, and overwhelming application of legal resources. Master Chief Santos felt a surge of anticipation. This was exactly the kind of mission that used their skills for something that mattered on a personal level. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, you'll coordinate with base security and civilian law enforcement to ensure all legal procedures are followed correctly, Sarah said. Master Chief Santos, you'll handle the personnel support aspects and ensure Torres has everything she needs throughout this process. Captain Hayes, you'll provide command authority for any resources we need. The assignments were crisp, professional, and exactly what everyone in the room expected from a well-planned operation. But they were also personal in a way that normal missions weren't. The rest of you will provide intelligence support, documentation assistance, and operational backup as needed, Sarah continued. This is a volunteer assignment, off the record, and completely separate from your normal duties. Anyone who isn't comfortable participating can leave now with no consequences. Nobody moved. Every person in the room understood that they were being invited to participate in exactly the kind of mission that made their service meaningful beyond normal operational requirements. There's one more thing you need to understand, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had discussed. The scars you saw today aren't just reminders of what I survived. They're reminders of what happens when people who should protect others fail to act when action is needed. She looked around the room one final time, meeting the eyes of people who had followed her through dangerous missions and would now follow her through something even more personal. We have the training, we have the resources, we have the authority, and we have the moral obligation, Sarah said. Petty Officer Torres is going to get the protection she needs. Her ex-husband is going to face consequences for his actions, and everyone in this room is going to understand exactly what it means to use your capabilities to protect people who can't protect themselves. The briefing room was completely silent for a moment as everyone processed the magnitude of what their commander was proposing. Then, Captain Hayes stood up, followed immediately by Master Chief Santos and Lieutenant Commander Walsh. Within seconds, every person in the room was standing, showing their commitment to an operation that would test everything they believed about duty, loyalty, and the responsibilities that came with their training and authority. Commander Sarah Mitchell looked at her people and felt something she hadn't experienced since the day she had escaped from David Morrison 15 years earlier. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right people to make sure that no one under her command would ever have to face their battles alone. The mission to protect Petty Officer Torres would succeed, just as the operation against David Morrison had succeeded. But, more importantly, every person in that room now understood that their commander scars weren't just marks of survival. They were the foundation of a leadership philosophy that would protect and guide all of them through whatever challenges they might face in the future.